It's a Politics Wednesday edition of River to River from IPR News. I'm Ben Kiefer. Joining us today, Karen Kedrowski, Professor of Political Science, Director of the Carrie Chapman Catt Center for Women in Politics at Iowa State University, stepping into our Ames studio. Karen is also co-director of ISU's Center for Cyclone Civics. Hi, Karen.
Hi there. Happy Women's Equality Day.
Oh, I didn't know. Thank you for reminding us. Happy Women's Equality Day back to you. It kind of stumbled out of my mouth, but I mean it sincerely. Karen's expertise in gender and American politics. Evan Renfro with us in our Cedar Falls studio, Associate Professor of Political Science there at UNI. Hi, Evan.
Howdy, Ben. Good to be with you.
And you good to have you on. And you know, just to make it clear to our listeners, you're both political scientists. You have different areas of expertise. They will come in so handy today as we move through half a dozen different areas in our news. Evan, your expertise in international security, defense policy, Middle Eastern politics, and among other things, you're a former U.S. Air Force intelligence analyst. Later in the program, we want to talk about Iowa's toss-up Senate race and the governor's race that the Cook Political Report now calls leans Democrat. But first, undoubtedly the top story, the tariffs and the Iran war, the latest developments there. Let's start with the trade talks between the U.S. and Canada that collapsed a few days ago. Both sides now hitting each other with steep tariffs. The U.S. imposed 50% tariffs on roughly $20 billion. Fairly small. It's only about 5% of Canadian goods. Canada retaliates, confirmed by the finance minister there. They've got a more complicated setup for how they are retaliating, but matching U.S., they say dollar for dollar, rate for rate. Notably excluded from U.S. tariffs, oil, gas, fertilizer, most minerals, the categories that actually dominate Canada's exports. The prime minister up there, Carney, framing it as, you're at war when you get attacked. We got attacked. U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer calls it not a war. He calls it a tempest in a teapot. Let's start with you, Evan. You know, Canada's finance minister, that phrase, dollar for dollar, rate for rate, Carney, we got attacked, invoking the word war there. As someone who actually studies conflict, is that inflation of the vocabulary, or does the war framing capture something real here in your mind?
Well, no, I think it's mostly rhetoric. I mean, this is bad economics. It's not a kinetic type of war in any sense. I think another concern on top of this, though, is Mexico, because all of this is going to be wrapped up as U.S., Canada, and Mexico are still trying to negotiate a trade deal. So this is going to potentially throw a wrench into that whole process as well. So you're talking about really our biggest trading partners that we do day-to-day trading with and impeding the flow of capital in North America. So Canada, U.S., and Mexico really are all wrapped up in this.
Mm-hmm. And Karen, before your view, I'd like to throw in a quote, some audio from our U.S. Senator Charles Grassley on the tariffs. He addressed the tariffs in a call with reporters yesterday.
Well, I appreciate President Trump's willingness to take bold action to support U.S. producers. I'm hopeful negotiations will move forward very swiftly and that these tariffs will soon be lifted. Driving a wedge between the United States and Canada pushes our allies into the arms of countries like China, which exposes our nation to further economic and national security vulnerabilities. That's why the United States must make real progress on our trade negotiations with Canada.
Senator Grassley yesterday. So, River to River listeners, is the pain worth it if it means a tougher line with Canada? Or, in your view, is it already gone too far for Iowa's economy? We have gas prices, grocery bills already stretched. How much more room do you have to absorb a prolonged fight in this trade war with Canada, the fight with Iran, rising costs all at once? Join our conversation as we talk politics, 1-866-780-9100, River to River at iowapublicradio.org. Share your thoughts, Karen.
I just don't get it. I think is the easiest way of putting it.
Right.
I mean, Canada has been an ally for, 100 years. And, we have this long unprotected border as a symbol of the friendship and trust between the two nations. Canada is not just a major trading partner, but is also a major market for U.S. foodstuffs. The United States has a much more diverse climate that allows for things like the cultivation of fruits and nuts that are very hard to do in the Canadian climate. And so, they import things like grapes and blueberries and apples, in addition to what we might normally think of in terms of, corn or wheat or other sort of cash crops. And, the economies of the states, many of the states that border Canada, are just so incredibly integrated with Canada. I'm thinking upstate New York, the Detroit area and the southern cone of Ontario, that it just, like trying to pull these things apart is just going to destroy them both.
Yeah. Iowa's farm country, of course, Karen, voting heavily for this president. Now Canada is taxing their equipment on purpose. I want to get an economist. I think we'll try to aim for Friday for that to find out exactly what sectors in what are Trump states, according to the last election, are being targeted by Canada, because they're doing that. When the pain is deliberate and traceable to a policy you supported, I wonder, does that change how people vote, or does it change what they believe about the pain, Karen?
Both. I think it depends. It can change the way that people vote, but people are, they handle cognitive dissonance in different ways. So one might be that they would, totally change their opinions and act in a different way. Another one is that they just try to integrate this, like there must be some greater plan or something, and I still, support President Trump for other reasons or things like that. So do I think that it could potentially have a difference in the midterms? I think it could, especially for those that are, angry and upset about these policies and are then motivated to act on that anger.
Mm-hmm. Evan, from a geopolitical point of view, we heard Grassley say, applaud the president, calling it a bold move, but also in the same audio clip there saying, this is a move, we hope it gets resolved because this drives our longtime allies into the arms of people we don't consider longtime allies.
Right. That's the cognitive dissonance, the sort of mental gymnastics one has to do if you're in somebody like Grassley's shoes. You have to say, great job, sir. Please stop. And you see, he has to be very careful to not alienate a certain base. Meanwhile, he has to also acknowledge reality.
Yeah. Let's go to, because this connects, at least here in the Midwest, because we have inflation. We remarked that our gas is up over $4 a gallon here in Iowa. Again, I noticed, but much higher in many other states in the country. But Treasury Secretary Bessent's Operation Economic Outcast sanctions campaign. We're moving to Iran. I should have said that from the start. Operation Economic Outcast launched on Monday, facing its first real test hours after the announcement a tanker was hit by a projectile off Oman's coast. That's an escalation, Evan. Bessent has since called the rollout a warning shot rather than a full campaign. The president called it, D-Day? So is it a warning shot? Is it D-Day? What do you make of this, Evan?
Well, this is all very, very strange stuff indeed, because typically, first of all, sanctions don't work normally, hardly ever. Look at Cuba, North Korea, Iraq. Iran's been under sanctions for a long time. Now they come out with this new operation. Now we're really serious. The first question would be, if this is going to be such a big deal, why didn't we start with that? So typically, under normal circumstances, you don't choose to start bombing a country unless American lives are in imminent risk. Otherwise, you would have a normal staffing process. You put the State Department on it. You do diplomacy. If that fails, you start doing economic sanctions. And if that doesn't work and there's about to be Americans killed, then you would send in the bombers. So they're sort of walking backwards to try to do more, somehow more intense sanctions. The other major problem that they're not talking about is China, because China is a big customer of Iranian oil, and about 80%. They're number one. So what they would have to do, because they're talking about sanctioning the secondary market, so that would be, for example, they don't, without saying it, that would be China. On the other hand, President Trump is well aware that he can't really pick a fight with China, especially with everything going on with Taiwan and our other interests, geostrategic interests in the Asia Pacific. So it's a real jam up here. So first of all, it's in the wrong order of the way things are supposed to be. Second of all, this sort of action historically does not work. So there you go.
Yeah, and one economist, Evan, called Operation Economic Outcast so far, quote, mostly just an announcement that there will be future announcements.
Yeah.
Is that a fair read?
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing else to it. It's sort of like running in place, where you have the pain of running, but you're not going anywhere.
Mm-hmm. Let's go to, I know we're coming up on a break, but we'll at least get Tony's question in this side of the break, and maybe we'll continue afterwards. Tony in Cedar Rapids, welcome to our program, 1-866-780-9100. Hey, Tony.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. We've got a minute before the break. Make it quick, please, sir.
I was just listening to you guys talk about Senator Grassley, and I had actually called his office because he has a bill in his committee, the Finance Committee, that would force any unilateral tariff to expire after 60 days. And I just wanted to, put that out there so maybe more people can contact Senator Grassley's office and ask them to kind of dust that legislation off.
Okay, we'll touch on that, see if our guests, Evan and Karen, have anything to say about that. Tony in Cedar Rapids, thanks for now. We're going to go to break and talk about what Tony mentioned, I think, after the break. The Trade Review Act of 2025 indeed would require congressional approval of unilateral tariffs proposed by the executive branch. So perhaps Congress wanting to wrestle back some of the power that the executive branch has pulled away. We'll talk about that when we return, and plenty more. It's Politics Wednesday edition of River to River from IPR News. Back with more of this Politics Wednesday edition of River to River from IPR News. I'm Ben Kiefer with Evan Renfro and Karen Kedrowski. Evan of UNI, Karen of ISU. And you, if you'd like to join us, 1-866-780-9100 or email us, rivertoriver@iowapublicradio.org. I think it's worthwhile to pick up on Tony's point there, because he mentioned the Trade Review Act of 2025 requiring congressional approval of unilateral tariffs proposed by the executive branch. That's the Senate Finance Committee members, Chuck Grassley and Maria Cantwell of Washington State, introduced that bipartisan legislation to restore Congress's constitutionally authorized role in setting and approving U.S. trade policy. Part of it states within 60 days, Congress must pass a joint resolution of approval on the new tariff. Otherwise, all new tariffs on imports expire after that deadline. And we have something similar going on in the U.S. House there. Karen, how do you read this? We don't hear much about Congress. With Evan's translation of Senator Grassley's words, I applaud the president. Now stop doing that. How do you read what Congress is doing here?
Well, Congress is trying to reassert its constitutional authority as over the power of the purse. So it's very clear in Article 1 of the Constitution that Congress has the authority to raise and levy taxes. And of course, that's exactly what tariffs are. When you were describing this, though, it really struck me how similar this language is to the War Powers Act, which again was an attempt by Congress to reassert itself over war making, because under the Constitution, it's Congress that declares war, not the president. So, I see it all in that vein as, Congress, really attempting to reassert its constitutional prerogatives. Yeah.
The Prime Minister of Canada, Carney, says the U.S. wanted terms limiting Canada's ability to make deals with anyone else. Evan, that really goes along with the president's thinking, saying Canada's going to be the 51st state, doesn't it? When you take away their ability to make deals with anyone else, doesn't it? It seems to.
Well, of course, and that's, from their perspective, absurd on its face. They're not going to do that. That would be a loss of sovereignty.
Yeah. Before we move on here, let's go to an email here. Oh, that's for a later conversation. Let's move on to, what you think is going to happen here. Evan, the picture that both of you have painted is on these tariffs. Karen, it doesn't look like a rosy scenario going forward. What would each of you say as possible outcomes here you see in months, hopefully not years? Karen?
I think it will come. I think Trump will back down. Remember, Trump always chickens out tacos. I think that especially as he's receiving feedback, from Republicans who are running for office and now have to, try and defend these unpopular tariffs on top of an unpopular war and rising prices and everything else, that he will figure out some way to say that, he didn't really mean it, or he's backing down, or he got what he wanted, or even deny that he had ever done this in the first place, moving forward. So I don't really expect that they will stand very long.
Mm-hmm. Evan, your final word on this for now?
Well, I just totally agree with Karen on this. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's move on to, we're inside 70 days before our midterm elections. Two especially hot races watched nationally here in Iowa, the Cook Political Report. Let's start with the U.S. Senate. That open seat hasn't been, 20 years since we've had an open. No, I've got that backwards. That's the governor's seat. Anyway, the Cook Political Report moved Iowa's Senate race to a flat toss-up. Republican incumbent Ashley Hinson, Representative Hinson versus Democratic State Representative Josh Turek. Cook says the political environment is, quote, uniquely challenging for the GOP in Iowa right now. Hinson's ad, we'll listen to that in a moment, but let me get your read on this, Karen. Trump carried our state by 13 points just 2 years ago. What has gone wrong for a 13-point state to become a toss-up in, 20 months?
Well, let me start with tariffs, and then let me also conclude with, rising oil and diesel prices and fertilizer prices, and, of course, just the absolute evaporation of the traditional markets for Iowa soybeans and corn. So that has, that economic hardship has affected a lot of people. But secondly, I would also just note to our listeners that the electorate for a midterm race when there's no presidential race is different from that in presidential years. It's typically lower, and those who show up are really much more politically efficacious and engaged in the political process. So what we have seen nationally, and I believe it's the same thing in Iowa too, is that Democrats are much more motivated to participate in this midterm election than are Republicans. And so if people are complacent and pretty happy with what's going on, they're just not going to be as motivated to show up and vote, especially since President Trump's name is not on the ballot.
Mm-hmm. Representative Hinson has said many times she'll be the president's top ally in the Senate. Karen, now in a state where the president's approval has gone underwater, is that promise now an asset she's stuck with, or do you expect she will quietly retire that emphasis?
Well, I mean, obviously her messaging has been moving towards attacking Josh Turek rather than defending her record and talking about her closeness to President Trump. But it is an important, message to put out to the base, the Republican base, and especially those who are, highly approve of President Trump in an effort to get them to, show up. It was definitely a winning message in the primary, but it may not have quite the same power going into the general election.
Let's get a sample of ads currently running. There are many of them. This is just excerpts from a couple of them from these camps. Earlier this month, U.S. Congresswoman Ashley Hinson's campaign launched an ad for the general election called Matters. Here are excerpts.
I ended up missing about 50% of the votes in the Iowa legislature this year. I don't know if that necessarily matters to Iowans.
Doesn't matter? Josh Turek skips work half the time and thinks you don't care. Now he wants a promotion?
I'm Ashley Hinson. I approve this message.
Juxtapose that with last week, Iowa Representative Josh Turek released an ad touting his votes with Republican lawmakers in Iowa.
Just some of the more than 700 times Josh Turek voted with Republicans to look out for Iowans. It's why Republicans call him results-oriented and newspapers praise his bipartisanship. In the Senate, Josh will work with anyone to clean up corruption and secure the border, including President Trump. And he's got 700 votes to prove it.
Okay, Karen, comment on these two ads or the other ads you've been seeing. Of course, Turek's had a really well-known wheelchair basketball video with former President Obama. That was a hit on the web. But what are your thoughts here about the ad war in this race?
Yeah, well, this discussion about votes is... I think it's worth placing a lot of this in context. First of all, most votes that are cast are very routine and are practically unanimous or are, a voice vote anyway. Things like approving the record, the minutes or, other procedural votes. So to say that he missed half the votes, which I think probably has some truth to it, given that it, Josh Turek actually sort of admitted this, doesn't mean that they were all really substantive legislative votes. And then the same thing is true for the claim about bipartisanship. A lot of these votes are not partisan, right? Especially if they are procedural votes or other sort of normal business of the day. So that could also be kind of claiming something because, he does not speak in specifics about any sort of particular pieces of legislation that might have been otherwise contentious or that he had co-authored with, Republicans that would, really demonstrate his sort of moderate credentials.
I put the cart before the horse there. That was in answer to Monty, our listener in Gowrie, talking about asking him how much he should be Monty should be concerned about these missing 58 votes in the legislature. And Karen, I think you gave us your view on that. And for the gender and framing here, Karen, I wonder if you thought about this because Hinson, former TV reporter, well known in parts of Iowa, now an incumbent being attacked for her record. Turek is the challenger. Nobody knows yet, or I'll just say it that way. That's a reverse of the usual gender script, isn't it? Where the woman is the newcomer proving herself.
Well, in some ways, I think it's worth clarifying that Ashley Hinson is not an incumbent in the sense that she is running for the seat that she has held, right?
Correct.
This is an open seat race, but she does have a congressional legislative record that she runs on, right? And that means that she has to defend the unpopular votes just as she is touting the more popular votes that she thinks are going to resonate with Iowans. And Josh Turek, of course, is building his brand.
Yep. Let's move to the governor's race. The Cook Political Report now rates that race leans Democrat. State Auditor Rob Sand over Republican challenger Zach Lane. Let's listen to a couple of ads there. Earlier this week, State Auditor Rob Sand released a new campaign ad focusing on education.
Like most Iowa parents, we want to focus on math and reading, not political agendas from either extreme. And like all Iowans, I want us to get back to having the best public schools in the country, not in the bottom half. We're losing to Nebraska, folks. As governor, I'll fight for Iowa's public schools, because my kids are counting on them too.
Hey, Rob, we've got listeners in Nebraska. Anyway. Last week, Republican Zach Lane released an ad where he accuses Democrat Rob Sand of planning to raise taxes.
On our farm here in Belle Plaine, we see it every day. Gas, groceries, everything's expensive. Iowa families are hurting. But Rob Sand wants to raise your taxes by $7,500 a year. You can look it up. He is a billionaire.
Okay, Karen, what do you make of this? And I don't want to exclude Evan. I know your expertise in political science is often outside the United States. But let's go to Karen first. What do you think of this move here by the Cook Political Report based on an aggregate of polls that, of course, they're looking at?
Yeah, I think that I've looked at the Cook report, and I've also looked at the various other polls as well. And I think that there is a wave, of support for sand, at least, in the snapshots that are these polls. But the difference is not huge, right? The difference is not huge. And, I think it's outside the margin of error, but not by a lot. So I would say that this is far from a settled race at all. But I think that, Sand is doing a pretty darn good job of talking in very careful language about things that Lane is vulnerable on, right? So supporting a private school in Kansas, talking about, quality of life issues as sort of a native Iowan. And of course, on Lane's side, calling Democrats, wanting to raise taxes is just straight out of the Republican playbook. It's very popular. Nobody likes to pay taxes. So threatening to raise taxes, irrespective of how that money might be spent, is always, framed as something of a threat.
And you teed up a little promotion for tomorrow's show. Karen, you'll talk about the constitutional amendment vote that'll be on our ballot in November that will make it harder. Not a simple majority, but 2/3 vote in the legislature to raise taxes here in Iowa. That's for tomorrow.
Yep, that's tomorrow.
We'll talk about that. But I wanted to add here that beyond this ad war and what we've talked about, cancer has become a defining issue in this race. And as a matter of fact, when I spoke with Jeff Kaufman, the chair of the Iowa Republican Party on Monday, he thinks something's going to move here. And this is a good point here in this race because Lane ties Iowa's high rate of cancer to water quality, nitrate pollution for agriculture, sand this week standing, on the side of cleaner water as well. But I also used headlines this week about a new mRNA melanoma treatment to attack Lane over his mRNA skepticism. What do you think about that, Karen?
Right. Well, cancer is certainly a key issue. And Lane has, really staked his primary victory on being willing to talk about the cancer crisis in Iowa and pointing out that Randy Feenstra was not taking those kind of strong positions and that he seemed to be siding with Big Ag that were, was potentially a major polluter. The mRNA vaccine is really interesting because there is a lot of skepticism about it back from our COVID days. Even though, a lot of scientists say that the science behind it is, rigorous and that it's a very safe vaccine and very efficacious when used in vaccines. So this is another way of sort of capitalizing on the, sort of fear of cancer and definitely attempting to show which one of these two candidates is taking the cancer crisis most seriously.
Evan, chip in if you'd like here on these races here, high-profile races here in Iowa.
Well, I think it's a good point to mention the linkage between you have the water quality. It sounds like they agree on where the difference is in. You start talking about mRNA and the vaccine stuff. Washington Post has a great tool available that shows you vaccination rates by school districts nationwide. You can look around, you can see how those have decreased since in the last few years. And with that, direct correlation is an increase in things that had been eradicated more or less, like smallpox, and these other sorts of things. So, we know that, science works with these vaccines, but not everybody believes it, and there's a core group out there that are, have their hearts set on refusing that.
Karen, back to you. Candidate Lane says you can't discuss Iowa's cancer rate honestly without discussing water quality and farm chemicals. Now that, as you mentioned, that's a Republican taking on Iowa ag. Is that, in your opinion, a real realignment or talking points that will not be carried through? Is there momentum on really discussing water quality and farm chemicals in this state that now has perhaps bipartisan support?
Well, what I hear is one Republican being willing to make these kinds of statements. Now, if Lane is elected, the governor has enormous agenda-setting power and can certainly challenge the Republicans in the legislature to, take some positive steps towards dealing with the water quality issues. But, otherwise, right now, it is Lane trying to get elected.
Okay, you hear the music? We've got to take a break. We'll be back with more analysis from Karen Kedrowski of ISU, Evan Renfro of the University of Northern Iowa. Join us, 1-866-780-9100, river to river at iowapublicradio.org. Let's talk about that Supreme Court ruling mail-in voting. It's kind of complicated. We'll explain it after the break and get Karen and Evan's view on the Supreme Court. They're letting Trump's mail ballot order move forward for now. Back with more of this Politics Wednesday edition of River to River from IPR News. I'm Ben Kiefer on this 26th day of August, 2026, with Evan Renfro and Karen Kedrowski, our two political scientists, providing their analysis of about a half dozen things that we're hearing in our news regularly, and we invite you to join us, 1-866-780-9100. Darcy in Dallas Center wants us to linger a bit on that governor's race. Darcy, welcome to the program.
Yes. Hello.
Hi, you're on the air. Go ahead.
Thanks. Well, one thing I noticed was when you were discussing the political ads between Rob Sand and Zach Lane, one thing that was kind of skimmed over was Lane's purported stating that Rob Sand is a billionaire, which that either mistakenly or on purpose was said, and it's not true. He's confusing Rob Sand with Robert Sand, who's a completely different person and executive at Constellation Brands. So that ad is not even correct.
Interesting. Thank you, Darcy, for joining us from Dallas Center. You know, we did have Lane's ad calling Rob Sand a billionaire. Karen, you know anything about this?
No, though it did strike me that language was in there. There's nothing that I think substantiates that. Rob Sand has spent his career in public service, and one does not become a billionaire in public service.
Yeah. Okay. Politics Wednesday edition of our program. Let's move on to the Supreme Court, letting the president's mail ballot order move forward for now. It's a 6-3 ruling that the states suing were too early to challenge it. The DHS can start building a federal citizenship list, and the U.S. Postal Service can now proceed with new ballot design rules. Still blocked, forcing the U.S. Postal Service to withhold ballots from anyone not on the federal list. 3 liberal justices dissented, warning that this creates confusion right before the election. Gavin Newsom, governor of California, says they'll sue. The White House calls it a win for election security. Karen is kind of involved here. Help us understand.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time sort of untying this knot. So the court did not rule on election security, but picked an out. And that out was that they said that the states did not have standing because the post office had not issued its final rule. The post office issued its final rule just at about the same time as the Supreme Court decision was handed down, but obviously after it was written, but also said that they would not enforce it for the 2026 election. But based on that Supreme Court decision, the fact that the final rule is now out then gives the states that are suing, by the court's own definition, standing to sue. And what the constitutional issue is here, let me go back to the Constitution. I've been talking about that a lot today, is that the Constitution very clearly delegates to the states the time, place, and manner of elections. And so what President Trump is arguing is that the states are not doing a sufficiently good job to determine who is eligible to vote, that only citizens are voting. The states are arguing that this is not a major issue and that this is federal overreach onto what are states' constitutional prerogatives. I think the states have got a good argument here, but this Supreme Court has been famously very supportive of Trump administration policies and has really kind of bent over backwards to support the president in, I think, in some ways that are actually fairly tenuous. What this is really going to mean for 2026, because now there's a whole separate case that came out of Massachusetts that has put an injunction on the enforcement of these rules in place, and that is still holding. But what it really means is that it is going to cast doubt on the legitimacy and the fairness of American elections and people's faith that our elections are fair and secure. Even if it doesn't really make a big difference in terms of how states are going to proceed literally in the next week to start sending out absentee ballots.
You know, seeing that CBS, a local CBS affiliate here in Iowa, saying that Iowa's not among the 23 states sued. I don't know if you know for sure there, Karen. Our Secretary of State, though, Pate, says the office says it doesn't expect direct impacts. I mean, what's the honest answer for an Iowa voter who says, does this affect me? And does this affect Iowa county auditors in election time?
The short answer is no, not right now, right?
Yeah.
And, you know, the Secretary of State went along with President Trump's request to turn over the voting rolls to make sure that they were checked against, you know, documentation of citizenship, to make sure that only U.S. citizens are on our voting rolls. So, you know, that piece is underway, even though a lot of states have contested that. I really don't think that this is going to have a huge impact on the 2026 election, other than to undermine faith in elections. But how our election administrators are going to proceed, this will be negligible.
You see it the same way, Evan?
Yeah, I think undermining faith in the elections is hugely important. One way to do that is to sow confusion, which this does. It's even difficult for experts to follow this, much less somebody that wants to vote by mail. It's likely they say, oh, the heck with it. I don't even know if they're going to count it. But, you know, the president calls this a terrible, cheating, corrupt system. He just voted in the Florida Republican primary by mail.
Right.
Just this month.
And I think, too, that the whole term voting by mail, which is used everywhere, is very confusing. So does it mean absentee ballots, because those go in the postal service, or does it mean what happens in certain states, like Washington State, where everybody gets a ballot, right? There is no live in-person polling on Election Day. All of the ballots are distributed and collected through the Postal Service.
Let's tackle this White House staff exodus before our hour ends. We've got about 10 minutes left. The list has grown to 6 senior aides. Evan and Karen, I'm sure you've been watching this. 6 senior aides departing within about a month. We have, of course, the press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, a young mother, counsel Dave Warrington, legislative affairs director James Braid, deputy national security Andy Baker, pardon attorney Ed Martin, and aide Emily Underwood. We have one replacement, I think, confirmed, the new White House counsel, Will Scharf. Evan, what do you see in this exodus? Small exodus, I guess we can say at this point. Predictable ahead of midterms?
I think so. If I was a cynic, I might say that people are exiting before House subpoenas start arriving. But that's only if I was a cynic. People are exiting federal government en masse. CIA's a third of their employees have left. So many people have left OPM, Office of Personnel Management, that they can't process the retirement paperwork. So as all of these federal government employees are leaving under duress, they're having to wait to get their retirement checks. And all of this is intentional.
Karen, these are staffers that have worked for the president for 2 years. They're just 2 years away from leaving office anyway. What do you see as the actual trigger? Midterms, something about this White House specifically?
I actually don't think this is that unusual. I think it's just that it's all clustered, sort of at the same time that it appears to be a massive exodus. Most people who are political appointees, and these are, political appointees, really don't spend a lot of time in their positions, especially when you're looking at people who work directly in the White House. The hours are long, they're terrible, there's very little sort of free time or personal time available to be with one's family. Also, many of these people are able to make much more money in the private sector than what they would if they continued in the government sector. So there's, opportunity costs to government service in addition to the really difficult working conditions. And then, of course, I would, not factor out just the sort of personal exhaustion that would come from these high-stress positions working in this White House. So while it is an honor and a privilege to work in anyone's White House for the president, it does exact a huge toll.
Evan, with your national security expertise, we have, I think, a deputy national security advisor leaving at the end of the month. We have a war in its 6th month. A new economic campaign against Iran just launched. You have been an intelligence officer in the past. What do you see going on there? Are there people stepping into those shoes readily, or does this create a bit of a problem?
It's a bit of a problem. One of the problems here is Secretary Rubio is dual-hatted. Kissinger was the last time. This was both the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor. National Security Advisor is a key role in the staffing process because they're the boss of the National Security Council, which is sort of the president's own hand-picked people basically across 16 different intelligence agencies that report directly to the president's office. So the National Security Advisor gets to, very uniquely, and besides the National Security Advisor, only the Chief of Staff gets to sort of see the president whenever they want to. So they have an immense responsibility. Rubio has that plus running the State Department. So his deputy then would be all the more crucial in this role. It's a huge responsibility. Under normal circumstances, the staffing process is long and arduous, complex, and you get these sort of rigorous answers back to avoid strategic blunders. But if you're doing things in this ad hoc manner, and if you choose to ignore that process, then you can sort of, it becomes less important, I suppose.
Yeah. Evan, as a military veteran and with your expertise in foreign policy, I wanted to ask you quickly about this because it's something that, we haven't reported extensively on in our news here, but certainly worth mentioning. Iowa's 734th Regional Support Group of the Iowa Army National Guard has taken over, it happened earlier this month, a NATO support mission in Poland under Operation Atlantic Resolve. Now, to be clear, the 734th is a regional support group, logistics, not combat. Poland under Atlantic Resolve. Meanwhile, the shooting war in the Gulf. Your view as someone who's interested in national security, what does all this say about where American forces are stretched, that Iowa's Guard is holding a line in Europe while fighting is going on somewhere else?
So, this is a huge issue. They're trying to deploy all of these elements of the national security apparatus in ways that they weren't structured to do. So National Guard is great and is really for, in emergencies, there's a hurricane, stuff like that. These are folks that are not active duty personnel. And so you're sending them, because the reason you're having to send them to Poland on these sorts of exercises is because you have everybody else doing all these other things around the globe. And so you only have so many troops. The problem is you're stressing the forces with an extremely high operational tempo, which is okay for short periods of time. But the longer you do that, the more stress that builds, and too much stress is going to lead to fractures in the system.
Mm-hmm. In the final few minutes of here, I want to remember that students return to campus this week, both at your institutions, Iowa State, Karen, and UNI, Evan. We have a trade war, live conflict overseas, critical midterm year, all converging at once. I want to ask you, each of you, what that's like. Gender and political representation is your wheelhouse, Karen. This semester opens with 2 competitive Iowa races, a national story about we didn't talk about it, the young females' aids proximity to power, Natalie Harp. Do you find yourself pulling current events into class faster than usual this year?
Well, I always do it, and some years are definitely a wash and blessing, shall we say?
Yeah. Cyclone Civics, you're a co-director there, built around civic engagement. Karen, does a moment this volatile make that mission easier to sell to our youngest voting generation, or harder?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of interest and eagerness amongst the students that I've been talking to participate in the political system.
Mm-hmm. Evan, you're walking into a classroom this week, live war, new sanctions, trade fight with Canada, all breaking in real time. How does that change your teaching, or does it?
Well, yeah, I always bring in current events. I teach international security, and when you're teaching international security under the times that we live in, it's very interesting, and certainly the students are quite curious about how and why and what's going on, but I could use some boredom in that area. It would be nice at this point.
College students arriving this fall, they've lived through, just to give their perspective and shorter lives than ours, they've lived through tariffs, a war, a contested Supreme Court ruling on their own ability to vote by mail. Karen, I bet you notice that a student walking to your class is different than one 5 or 10 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're also still seeing the lingering effects of COVID. With that interrupted learning, learning losses that it takes a while for students to recoup. And, quite frankly, we're all just, have really been transformed in terms of how we can use video conferencing, for example. So, yeah, it's very different than it was 10 years ago.
We'll hang on for the rest of the ride into the future, and we're glad to have your analysis. Karen Kedrowski of Iowa State University, Professor of Political Science, Director of the Carrie Chapman Catt Center for Women in Politics. Evan Renfro, Associate Professor of Political Science at UNI. Evan and Karen, thanks for spending the hour with us, and thanks for the input from our listeners.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you.
Karen will be back for part of the program tomorrow. We're going to talk about whether Iowans, we get to decide whether 2/3 of the legislature, not a simple majority, is needed to raise the state income tax. That's an amendment that will be on our ballot. Karen will explain that to us tomorrow. Today's show, produced by Caitlin Troutman. Technical assistance from Nev Kelly, Tony Daner, and Sean McLean. A little squeaker at the end. Gotta get some tea, I guess. I'm Ben Kiefer. Thanks for joining us.